I am Dr. Pavitra Bharadwaj. I am Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science, Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. So friends, keeping in mind that you all are pursuing the courses which are being offered to you through the CEC medium, this series that we are taking up is on data mining, and today's lecture, this lecture is going to be the 15th lecture in this series. So friends, we are talking about the concept, the domain, the subject of data mining. We all know that data mining is one of the most talked about areas of computer science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, even biology and computational biology, and different areas are heavily dependent upon, analysis of their data on data mining. And so far we have discussed a lot about data mining, about data, about the characteristics of data, how data is pre-processed, and what are the different techniques that are used for the data mining. So in the last few lectures we were talking about classification analysis, and basically what was classification analysis? That is, we identify, we create a model and using the test data. Okay, so we have two sets of data. First is the training data, or using which the the model is created, and then we have the test data. Using the test data and the model, we assign a class to every data object, right? So this, we call this as the supervised learning. Supervised learning means that we are creating a model, and then using that model we are going to assign, or we are going to classify the data that we are getting. Okay, so classifying the data here means that you are assigning a class label to that data, right? So that is called supervised classification. But now what we are going to talk about today is something beyond that. We are going to talk about cluster analysis. So in today's lecture, what we are going to talk about is, we are going to talk about unsupervised classification, as it is sometimes also known. So unsupervised classification means, or what we also will call as cluster analysis. We will be grouping the data, we will be creating clusters of the data, but there is not going to be any model. So we are not going to develop any model for classifying or for dividing the data into different groups, but we are going to do it using the properties of the objects, the individual properties of the object. So this particular realm is known as cluster analysis. So basically, what is cluster analysis? In cluster analysis, we will find groups of objects, okay, so that the objects in one group will be similar or more related to one another, and they will be different from or unrelated to the objects in the other groups, right? So you can see here in the diagram, we can see that three groups of objects are being shown here. The objects may be, we are representing them as dots, right? So what we are trying to achieve is that the intra-cluster distance is to be minimized. If we say that our clustering scheme is a good clustering scheme, so then the distance between the objects within the same cluster has to be minimized. Within the same cluster means that the properties of the different objects within one group are very much similar. The objects which are lying in one group are very much similar, right? Whereas the inter-cluster distance has to be maximized. Inter-cluster distance means that the two objects belonging to two different clusters, they have to be very different from each other. They have to be very far away from each other. They should be very, very unrelated to each other, right? So this is the main objective of cluster analysis, that we are going to divide the data, divide the objects into groups, and our objective in this division will be to minimize the intra-cluster distance and to maximize the inter-cluster distance. That is, the objects in two clusters should be as far as possible, they should be as unrelated as possible, right? So cluster analysis, basically what it does is that it divides the data into groups, which are also known as clusters, and this can be done either for two purposes. First is for meaningful, okay, then you also would like to divide the groups so that the grouping is useful, and sometimes it is for both. So groups can be meaningful groups, they can be useful groups, or sometimes the groups can be useful or meaningful groups, right? So if our goal is to create meaningful groups, then the cluster should capture the natural structure of the data, right? If however it is being done for data summarization, right? So then it is for a useful purpose, it is for a particular use that we are trying to clusterize the data, like data summarization, right? So in that case our purpose for clustering is different. So what we are trying to say here is that clustering can be done with two different objectives. First is to create meaningful clusters, second could be to create useful clusters, right? So if whether you are doing it for understanding or making it more meaningful, or you are doing it for enhancing the utility, cluster analysis has definitely played a very important role in different fields like psychology, social sciences, biology, statistics, pattern recognition, information retrieval, machine learning, and of course data mining. So if first we will see that what happens when we are trying to create the clusters for understanding, that is we are trying to group the data to create classes or conceptually meaningful groups of objects which will share common characteristics, right? So this this we actually, if you see that human beings, they have an innate tendency to classify or to group objects. Even if you show a picture to, you show different pictures to a child, so the child is also going to identify or label similar objects within that picture. So we have this natural instinct of creating clusters of similar objects, right? So in this context, when you are creating the clusters for potential classes, cluster analysis becomes the study of technique for automatically we are finding the classes. Automatically we want to create the clusters within the data. Now there are various areas, there are various applications where the clustering is being done for enhancing the understanding of the data, or to provide meaning to the cluster, or the groups are being created for enhancing the understanding. So the first area very commonly used and very old application of clustering is in the area of biology, right? So in biology, those who are familiar with basic biology would also know that biologists, they have been creating a taxonomy, that is they create a hierarchical classification of all living things. How? They will create, they will have kingdom, then in the kingdom they will have phylum, in phylum they will have class, in class they will have further species, and they have different types of taxonomical classifications that they do for classifying all living organisms, right? So what is this? This is basically an early work in cluster analysis, and this has been also done in mathematical taxonomy, right? So what we are doing is that we are automatically finding the classification structures using these. So in biology, when we create this kind of hierarchical structuring, we do this. Now, even now in more recent times, this clustering has been used very widely for genetic information, right? Because we have so much large amounts of genetic information, so clustering is used to find groups of genes that have similar functions. So all the groups, all the genes which have got similar functions, they are being put in, say, different clusters, and then they are being studied. So here the clustering is being done so that the meaning coming out of the data is enhanced, the understanding from the data has been enhanced. Another area where clustering is used is information retrieval. Now we all know that the World Wide Web has got billions of web pages, right? And whenever we type a query in any search engine, we will get thousands of pages in return to the query. So here also clustering, when we want to have specific retrieval of information, or retrieval of specific information rather, So their clustering can be used to group the search results into small number of clusters, and each of these will capture a particular aspect of the query. Like for example, if you query about movies, right? So when the pages are returned to you, the pages will be grouped into different categories like movie reviews or movie trailers or movie stars or movie theaters or whatever movie collections, etc., etc. So what will be done? Each category or each cluster will be further broken into subcluster, and therefore a hierarchical structure will be created, and this hierarchical structure will give better understanding of the query results for the user. So what we are saying here is that when information is organized in the form of a hierarchical structure, or when clusters and subclusters are formed out of the result of the query, then information retrieval, the task of information retrieval also becomes very, very easy, right? Another very important area where clustering is being done is in the climate sciences or weather forecasting, etc., right? So if one wants to understand the pattern in the climate or weather on the surface of the earth or in a particular area, so what is to be identified? The patterns in the atmosphere and the ocean temperatures, etc. So cluster analysis is applied to find these patterns in atmospheric pressure, in ocean temperature, that have a significant impact on climate. So here also we are actually creating clusters to add meaning or add more understanding to the data about the climate of a particular place. Then of course in case of psychology and medicine, right, we all know that an illness or a particular condition, medical condition has come, it has got variations, a number of different types are there. Like for example, if there is depression, so depression itself can be classified, it can be identified as different types of depressions, right? It's a psychological disorder. So cluster analysis can be used to identify these subcategories within the cluster, right? And it is also being used, cluster analysis is also being used for detecting patterns in the occurrence and distribution of diseases, that is in which area a particular disease is occurring and at what time of the year, or in what is the temporal distribution of a disease. So here also clustering analysis is very important because it is allowing a better understanding of diseases, occurring of diseases, and also classifying the disease from generic to more specific items, from generic to more specific information. And of course in the area of business, now we all know that businesses, they collect large amounts of data, right? So they will collect data about the current customers, they will collect data about potential customers. So again clustering can be done here to divide or to segment the customers into a small number of groups for additional analysis and marketing activities. So all these areas, whatever we have discussed, whether it is medicine, either psychology, it is information retrieval, business, biology, all these areas are using clustering for enhancing the understanding of the data or enhancing the meaning of the data. Then we also come across various other applications of clustering where we are doing it for utility purpose, that is to make it more useful, right? So here what we are doing, in this case we are using clustering analysis because it provides an abstraction from individual data object to the clusters in which those objects reside. So what we are saying is that looking at the properties of the different objects which are there in the cluster, we can characterize each cluster in the form of a cluster prototype, right? That is the data object which will be representative of the objects in the cluster, right? So this prototype is going to define all the properties of the objects which are residing or which are a part of that particular cluster, right? So this cluster prototypes then can be used on the basis for a number of additional data analysis or data processing techniques, right. So therefore, in the context of utility also, cluster analysis is very important, because it gives us techniques for finding out the most representative cluster prototypes, because later on also we will see that prototype bound clusters are also very commonly used. So this term prototype and how the prototype is created from looking at the cluster properties is very, very important, right. Like for example, sometimes we cannot look at the complete data set, right. Like for example, there are some data analysis techniques like say regression analysis, or we have principal component analysis, right. So they have a very high time and space complexity, that is they will require a lot of processor time and memory space, because they are order of m square complexity, right. So even higher sometimes, where m is the number of objects, right. So what is happening, that if it is a very large data set, then this kind of analysis cannot be done on the complete data set. So what we want is that instead of applying the algorithm on the entire data set, we are actually going to apply the algorithm on a reduced data set consisting only of cluster prototypes. Why? Because we said that the prototype is representative of the cluster. So instead of using it on the complete data set, we are only applying the algorithm on the cluster prototype, right. And depending on the type of analysis and the number of prototypes, the accuracy with which the prototype represent the data, the result can be comparable to those that would have been obtained if all the data could have been used. So if if the analysis is accurate, and if the prototypes which are used are also representative of the complete data, then your results can be very, very representative, the results can be very, very correct, right. Then second type of technique for clustering which is used in case of adding meaning to your data, or in case of adding utility to your data, is compression. So in compression, what happens, that we are going to use cluster prototypes that we discussed already, and they will be used for data compression, right. So what we will do is that we will create a table, and in this table we will have the prototype for each cluster, right. That is, the prototype is assigned an integer value, that is its position in the table. So we give an index value to each prototype, and each object is represented by the index of the prototype associated with its cluster, right. So what happens, that each object will have a prototype, it will have a number, it will have an integer associated with its cluster. Now this kind of representation of each object's property, right, this type of compression which we are doing is known as vector quantization, right. And vector quantization is very commonly used in case of image files, in case of sound files and video files. Why we can use this? Because here the data objects are highly similar to one another, right, and a little loss of information is acceptable, because we know that a few pixels, even if dropped from an image, will not make a perceptible difference to the appearance of the image or the video, and a substantial reduction in the data size is desired. So here also we can use the prototype and index mechanism to compress the large data such as images, audio and video files, right. Then also it is very efficiently used in finding the nearest neighbors. Nearest neighbors can require computing the pairwise distance between all points. So if you have 2 points and you have to compute the distance between the 2 points, then you need to find out the nearest neighbor technique. So clusters and their prototypes can be found much more efficiently in these kinds of situations, right. So if objects are relatively close to the prototype of their cluster, then we can use the prototype to reduce the number of distance computation that are necessary to find the nearest neighbor of an object. Now this can be used when you are designing network points or when you are trying to design clusters of networks, right. So what we are looking at is we are only computing the distance from the prototype instead of computing the distance from each node. Why? Because again the same reason that prototype are being used as the representative of the group, right. So intuitively, if two cluster prototypes are far apart, then we will say that the object in the corresponding clusters cannot be nearest neighbors of each other. Why they cannot be? Because of the cluster prototype being apart, right. So therefore, you know, to find an object's nearest neighbors, it is necessary to compute only the distance to objects in the nearby clusters. So where the nearness of two clusters is measured by the distance between their prototypes. So instead of, you know, measuring the distance between two cluster objects, we are only measuring the distance between two cluster prototypes, so that it will give us, it will return the actual distance between the two clusters, whether the two clusters are close enough or they are far apart, right. So now we understand broadly, you know, that what is happening and why cluster analysis can be done, and what are the different areas, what are the different fields in which, you know, cluster analysis is carried out, right. Now cluster analysis, if we would like to define it formally, then what is cluster analysis? So far we have gathered that, you know, cluster analysis, it is a technique of grouping data object based on the information found only in the data that describes the object and the relationship, right. So here, you know, again we will go back to our concept of classification analysis. So here we are not comparing the object's information with any other outside model or any other information. It is solely dependent upon the properties of that particular object, okay, and the relationship that it has with the other objects in the group. So what is the goal? The goal is that the objects within the group will be very similar or related to each other, and those in different groups will be dissimilar or unrelated to each other, right. So the greater the similarity or homogeneity within the group and the greater the difference between the group, the better or more distinct the clustering, right. So in the very beginning of the lecture we had understood this, that the main goal of cluster analysis is to minimize the distance within the group and to maximize the distance between the two different groups, right. So therefore this entire, you know, exercise of creating the clusters and analyzing those data clusters is going to return us these two main goals, right. So because now we have already studied classification analysis in detail, it's very important, because many a times, you know, clustering is regarded as a form of classification, right, because classification and clustering are doing the same thing, you know, they are dividing the data into groups, right. But in case of classification, the main difference is that it creates a labeling of objects with the class label, right. So here you have a class label or a cluster, right. For example, if you are classifying animals, okay, so you will classify them in two classes and give a label to each other, say for example vertebrates and invertebrates, okay. Or if you are classifying, you know, people in an educational institution, so you can classify them as giving labels like student and staff, okay. So these are the two labels or two classes of objects that you are creating, right. So however, it derives these labels only from the data, the labels which are derived only from the data, right. So in contrast, classification, as we know, is supervised classification. That is, you know, any unlabeled object is assigned a class label using a model which is developed from objects with the known class label. So we have this concept of training data and test data. So we already have class labels, and using that we are doing this. So for this reason, cluster analysis is sometimes also referred to as unsupervised classification, right. But generally in the case of data mining, whenever we are using the term classification, we know that it is supervised classification only, right, because classification means that we are using the model and we are assigning the label based on the results or the comparison of the properties of the object on the model, right. So basically this was, you know, an introduction to cluster analysis, and broadly speaking what are the different application areas in which cluster analysis can be used. We will be continuing with our discussion on cluster analysis in the following lecture. Till then, please keep watching CEC. Thank you.